Hey, what's up guys? Garrett here. Welcome back to another video. I want to talk about my tech stack when it comes to building my startups. So I've built, I don't know, three, four, five maybe startups at this point, and I've used a lot of different technologies. And I figured it'd be cool if I told you guys about which ones I use and why I use them. One thing I think it's interesting is that I've gotten a lot of advice over the years from engineers and from business people on which technologies to use to build my startup. For example, I've gotten people who tell me to use mobile development instead of Flutter. So like Swift, Kotlin, things like that. I have people that tell me to use Go instead of TypeScript. Kind of just like the list goes on, right? I've gotten a ton of advice, and it's all good advice, but I think for me, it has never, or at least is often advice that doesn't exactly work out. And the reason is kind of pretty simple, right? I know what I know, and you should be using what you know in order to build your startup so that you can build them as quickly as possible, you can support them as good as you can, and you can deliver the best product that you possibly can. Generally speaking, when it comes to actually picking a tech stack or technologies to use, I try to ask myself two questions. Number one, how well do I actually know this technology? So in some cases, I don't know it at all, and maybe it's not the right thing to use because I don't know it. So if I know Flutter, which I do, I have an app on the App Store right now that's built in Flutter, that makes sense to use Flutter because I know Flutter really well, but I don't know Swift at all, and I don't know Kotlin at all, right? So it might not make as much sense for me to use those. On the web side, I know Flutter pretty well, and you can technically make a web app with Flutter. But then the other question comes in, well, should you actually be using the technology to build that thing? So maybe there's a limitation that the technology has in which you can't actually build what you want to build. So for example, Flutter, probably not the best thing to build a web app with. Maybe you want to go for React or Next.js, in which case I've done that. That's makes a lot of sense as well. Let's talk about what I use on the front end first. So if I'm building a mobile app, I will most likely choose for Flutter. Flutter is awesome because it allows you to build a native app for iOS and for Android. If you need something that's more native, like so for example, I have this idea right now for an Apple Watch app that I'm going to actually make a video on soon. That app I wouldn't be able to use Flutter for because Flutter can't do wearables. So I would have to use Swift and the native Apple stuff. So in that case, I would have to learn it because I don't already know it, but I don't really have a choice. You can't use Flutter. Next is if I wanted to actually build a website. So even though Flutter can technically build a web app, I probably want some sort of SEO or maybe better performance. Flutter's a little bit slow when you're building web apps. So I'd probably go for something, well, not probably, I would definitely, as in I'm already doing this, I would go for something with Next.js, which also comes along with React. So far, I've had a really great experience. I have a startup right now that is using Next.js, and it's been working really, really well. As far as like the design library goes, I've used to use Bootstrap a lot in the past, and I really do love Bootstrap, but Next.js comes with Tailwind CSS kind of set up already. And I found that Tailwind looks pretty good, and I found a nice component library called Preline, which I've really been using and enjoying as well, and it looks pretty good, I think. So on the back end, I actually use a platform called Platform as a Service called Firebase. You might have heard of it. It's pretty awesome. It's from Google, so there's a lot of people always are kind of scared about Google killing things off. But Firebase is a product that has thousands of users. Many big apps use Firebase. So hopefully that means that they don't cancel it. But I've had a really, really great experience with Firebase. I use Firestore as my database. I use authentication, feature flags, notifications, storage, analytics, web hosting, serverless functions. The list kind of goes on. But I've had a really, really great experience with Firebase. I think everything's really easy to use. It's very simple. I know how to use it, which again is like the most important part. You can use it for mobile apps, web apps, games. I don't really make games. Maybe I'll make a game one day. That'd be kind of cool. But yeah, so you can use it for a lot of great stuff, and I think it's a really, really amazing platform as a service to use your backend, and it can actually speed things up quite a bit, which I think is awesome. If I'm going to do payments, I'll use Stripe. I actually incorporated my business through Stripe through a service called Stripe Atlas, so it kind of just makes sense, I think, that I would use Stripe, but even if I didn't do that, I'd probably still use Stripe. Stripe, I've just found to be really, really great, and the API is pretty easy. Also, the languages that I use, so I use Node.js, and I do so with TypeScript. The main reason that I do that is because Firebase actually has the best support for Node. They more recently, launched support for Python, but I don't know. I know, Node.js and TypeScript really well, so I think I'll just stick with that since I know it. The only thing I'd probably switch to Python for is if I ever needed to do some AI stuff, which might just happen, hint, hint. So we might be talking about that a little bit on this channel, even though I've already been talking about AI, more detailed and stuff like that potentially. But I think that would be, or like data science stuff. But for just back end, development kind of stuff, Node and TypeScript work really well, and Firebase has really, really excellent support for both of those things, which is why I don't use something like Go or Java or whatever else. On the database side, I'll go and use Firestore, which is the database that comes along with Firebase. It's really, really awesome. It's a NoSQL database, which is great because when you're first starting out with your app, chances are you might have a pretty good idea of what the data model should be, but chances are as you learn more and as you build more, you're going to be changing things a lot. You'll need to remove certain pieces of data, you'll need to add certain pieces of data. And if you have something like a relational database, this can become a little bit more challenging. But if you have a NoSQL option like Firestore or Mongo or whatever else, this is then a lot easier. The reason I use Firestore is because it's a part of Firebase, which I already use. But I've used Mongo in the past, and Mongo is pretty great too. I don't really have any problems. I know a lot of people don't like it, but I think it's a great database. Personally, though, just I've been using Firestore, and I've had a really great experience with it. So another database that you would potentially want to add in is a database called Neo4j. And so this is kind of getting into the more specific use cases for databases, but Neo4j is a graph database. And a graph database is a really great way to understand the relationships between your pieces of data, as opposed to just being able to understand the data itself. And so this is really great if you're building, let's say, a social network. You might want to be able to model that, person A is friends with person B, or that person A follows person B, but not the other way around, or maybe it is the other way around. A graph database like Neo4j makes this really, really easy. Typically, if I need to send emails, I will use SendGrid, which is an email, not really an email provider, that's just an email API that you can use to send emails. It works pretty well. It's relatively inexpensive. I haven't really had any problems with it, so that's pretty good. Then as far as monitoring goes, so I use Sentry, which is an application performance monitoring tool, and you can also monitor errors that come in. I use it for the iOS app that I currently have on the App Store, and it works really well. So I haven't used it yet for web, but that's something that I'm going to work on integrating in the near future. And then the last thing for monitoring like actual performance of the apps, I use two things. The first is for mobile, I use something called Amplitude. Amplitude is really, really awesome. It's very powerful. However, it can get really expensive. And so what I've more recently started to think about is using Google Analytics, because they have that kind of integrated into Firebase. And so I thought I would give that a shot, mostly because it's free. Secondly, because it's integrated, but mostly because it's free. It might not be as powerful. It might not be as easy to use. I haven't really dug in that much, but it's free, and I think there's a lot of value in that, especially as a solopreneur. So some final thoughts here. What I've kind of learned in my experience as far as a software engineer is that you can divide software engineers into two people. You can divide them however way you want, but for the purposes of this conversation, I think they kind of fit into two buckets. There are those who are like purists. They are pure engineers. As long as there's something to build, like the business side, the validation, the product has already been thought out, they will build you an amazing thing. They will use the right technologies, the right design patterns, the right databases, the right data model. Everything will be really, really well constructed. And then there are the engineers who are more so kind of in the business camp. Maybe they have an idea for themselves as to what they want to do, like for a startup, and they just so happen that either they work as a software engineer or they've taught themselves how to code because they realize that that's a useful skill in order to actually build the thing that they want to build. The people who are in the first camp, the people who are the engineering purists, they will tell you to use things like don't use Firebase, use CDK for AWS. They'll throw out something that is a bit more technical and kind of advise you to go that way. They might even advise you to use a language like Go or Rust, which are harder arguably to learn and use than TypeScript. But there is a good amount of technical advantage to be had or gained from using languages like that. But they might not make sense for what you're doing. And so that kind of brings us to the other side, which are the people who are more business minded. These people most likely will end up starting a business, but they will end up, as the business grows, kind of going to the business side. And if they want to build, like if they want to try and build like a huge business, like a unicorn type of thing, they're the people who will go to the business side and then bring in engineers who are more the purists to be able to kind of take on that engineering stuff, right? Or in the case of a solopreneur, like I am right now, they might, actually that's even more useful, I think, to kind of have your head in the business game of things, in the business side of things, because then you really have an understanding of like, okay, I can't just build stuff because it's cool. I need to build stuff and do so in a way that will, as quickly as possible, get me to the finish line so that I can generate revenue. And so, with that in mind, in that case, you might not want to use Go or Rust. You might just want to use Node and TypeScript because even though it's not the fastest thing in the world, even though it might have certain limitations in some contexts, in some situations, it will be able to get you to the finish line really, really quick. There's going to be a lot of pre-built packages and libraries that you can use that you can take advantage of to help you build your software. Um, Something like Firebase supports it really well. And so even though, again, Go might give you faster performance, you might be able to kind of ship faster with using Node because it works really well with Firebase. So those are some thoughts. That's my tech stack that I use. Hopefully that's interesting. Hopefully that's useful. In the next video, we're going to be talking about what I've used in the past because this was not always my tech stack. It used to be different. It used to be really different. So stay tuned for that video. That's coming out later in this week. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Also turn on the bell so you get a notification next time I do release a video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care. Peace.